All right. Returning from our break. It wasn't so painful now, was it? You know, the beautiful part about radio is it's free. And the second most beautiful part about radio is it's about the only place left where you can actually get truth over fiction. Truth over propaganda. Because the system right now and our society at large has fallen prey to the tyrants and the treasonists and the traitors and the statists. And, you know, when we're talking about how do you get access to information, if you're not listening to talk radio and you're not listening and reading alternative websites that promote truth over propaganda, then you're probably not aware of the depth of depravity that our nation has fallen into. And so I strongly encourage you to begin to reevaluate your sources of information. Because when we talk about, you know, websites like America's Voice Now, our statement is delivering truth and exposing mainstream propaganda. And we do that every day. We expose mainstream propaganda for what it is. A societal lie that is being shoved down your throat. And that ties into this talk about Syria and this chemical attack and what our actions are going to be. You know, the Obama administration has been telling the Associated Press there's very little doubt chemical weapons were used in Syria last week. We know that, and we're aware of the fact that, you know, we know chemical weapons were used. I mean, the evidence of that is pretty apparent. Doctors Without Borders, who I consider to be a far more credible source than any United Nations investigatory team or any government agency or anyone tied and connected at all with political aspirations or issues or agendas. Doctors Without Borders is a group who is non-political, and all they're interested in is helping people who they can help. They have made a clear claim that chemical weapons were used. And so I don't think we can doubt the fact that chemical weapons were used. So let's put that aside for a moment. We know they were. The questions really are, who used them, number one, and two, what should be done about it, and three, perhaps even more importantly, should the United States get involved, and is our national security contingent on our involvement? Let's put it that way. And the reason I say that is because, you know, every time we get involved in an international escapade, irrespective of how, humanitarian it may sound or seem, what the real issue here is that the warmongers and I'll give you an example. When we talk about people like McCain and Lindsey Graham, right? These guys are insisting that President Obama act now against the Syrian government. I mean, McCain has come out. This guy is a war hawk like nobody's business. And him and Lindsey Graham, and I tell you, somebody's got to have something on these two. Because they defy everything that the Republican Party should stand for. I mean, they are openly in opposition to the principles of republicanism. And it's almost hard to believe that, well, it's almost hard to believe unless you begin to consider the reason for their departure from prime ideological concepts of republicanism and freedom and liberty and government ruled by law. Once you start to take into account how and under what circumstances, because I'll tell you what, money can't alone be enough for these two. First of all, they're both phenomenally wealthy. When I say phenomenally wealthy, I don't mean in the Google sense. I'm not talking about Microsoft, Bill Gates sense. But, there's only so much money you can spend in a lifetime and leave to your heirs. And both McCain and Lindsey Graham are fabulously wealthy men. I mean, they are in the top 1% of, or they're in the top 10% of the top 1%. Let's put it that way. So there's no doubt that these people don't need money. There is doubt as to what would motivate them to take the stances they take against the best interests of the American people in issues like Syria, Obamacare, NSA, NDAA, indefinite detention. I mean, all of the things that our nation is vehemently and diametrically opposed to, that our population and our electorate and Americans in general are diametrically and philosophically and ideologically opposed to. And yet, they're elected officials. So how is it that as an elected official, they're not cognizant of your desire or willing to accede to the will of the people? And this example in Syria is just as telling. They're pushing and insisting that Obama act now. Now, they came out in a joint statement, but I got to tell you, there's folly in this thinking. First of all, we shouldn't be acting at all until we have a true grasp on exactly where the issues rise or end up. We need more information. You know, you wouldn't jump into a fight willy-nilly unless you understood what you were fighting for. And this is no different. Here's their joint statement, and this is a joint statement, so listen to the tone and the tenor of this thing. Using standoff weapons without boots on the ground and at minimal risk to our men and women in uniform, we can significantly degrade Assad's air power and ballistic missile capabilities and help to establish and defend safe areas on the ground. Now, what they're talking about is dropping some cruise missiles in here. There are warships that have moved into the Mediterranean. There are 4 destroyers that have moved in, and of course they have the capability to deliver significant levels of missile strikes, cruise missiles and others. And there's a couple of different ways this can go. I watched John Bolton get interviewed. In some ways, I like John Bolton, and in other ways, the guy turns my stomach. But in this particular instance, he made a lot of sense. He was asked, what are the potential paths that this can take? And his first point was, well, it can go one of 2 ways. We can go in there and do a strong show of force, but it has to be incorporated with the idea that what we're going to do is take out Assad himself. In other words, if we're not taking out Assad, we're wasting our time. And the reason for that is because, and he made it very clear, he was on Greta Van Susteren. It was an interview. I'll see if I can't find it for you. And, you know, in this discussion, basically what he was saying was that if we don't take Assad out of the picture, then we are effectively leaving ourselves wide open to this thing becoming some endless, this endless abuse. And so I'm going to try to find this for you, because I think it would be helpful for you to hear it. But the issue of let's see, what he's saying is essentially, if we're going to go in there, we should take Assad out. And Greta pinned him down, and she said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And he said, "I mean, kill him. I mean, that's what you do in war." And when you hear that coming from Bolton, who was the UN ambassador, by the way, under the Bush administration, much to the chagrin of the UN, you got to realize that what it does is it shows the clear and stark irony of what we are told every day that war is about. You'll notice that in every news or program that you've seen, they show these bodies that are wrapped in blankets or in sheets, and they don't show any real when they showed these children, they fuzzed the picture out and all of that. I'll tell you why they do that. They're trying to sanitize war. They want war sanitized for you so that you believe that it's not, as impacting as it is. I mean, when we're talking about the issue of war, government doesn't want you to realize the true implications of it. We haven't seen true war correspondence except for since probably Vietnam. And even then, we were kind of limited as to what we actually saw. And, I'll play this for you if I can. Let me just see if I can bring this up for you, because I think it would be a good opportunity for you to hear Bolton directly. He said it far more eloquently than I can. But here's the real problem, what we have. We've painted ourselves into this corner. I shouldn't say we. This administration has painted itself into a corner. And we're all going to end up holding the bag for his, indiscretions in declaring the red line and all that nonsense. Because once he's positioned this thing and declared this red line, now we've got a commitment that we have to adhere to. And, of course, the problem with that is that once you go there, we're stuck in this position where, for all intents and purposes, we are literally obligated to now meet the criteria of fulfilling his promise of, or threat, I should say, of intervention. And the statistics out this morning say that only 9% of America believes we should actually get involved there, because it's really not a national security issue. Let me see if I can give you this video.
Was Syrian President Assad, who ordered snipers to fire on UN inspectors? Snipers opening fire on inspectors' vehicles today as a UN team tries to investigate whether the Syrian government used chemical weapons against innocent civilians or not. But the Obama administration doesn't need more proof. Secretary of State John Kerry calling the chemical attack undeniable and a moral obscenity.
What we saw in Syria last week should...
I'm going to try to jump ahead to the part where Bolton comes on here, because what you're going to hear is Kerry calling this undeniable and a moral obscenity. And I don't have a whole lot of interest in John Kerry. I think he is a longtime traitor and betrayer of the United States and our interests, both domestically and internationally. And I wouldn't let that guy walk my dog, much less determine whether or not we should be involved in an international debacle. He's frankly a dangerous individual. And to place him in the position of Secretary of State, where he's negotiating on behalf of our entire nation, is the height of idiocy, in my opinion. But he's a sycophant for the administration, and so they're very interested in allowing him to promote the Obama agenda. So here's John Bolton.
Joins us. Good evening, sir. And I guess the question is, what do we do now?
Well, I think what President Obama is going to do is launch some sort of military strike against Syria, because now the second time his red line has been undeniably crossed. I think he has a real credibility problem in his own mind if he doesn't do something. That doesn't mean he has the slightest idea what the strategic effect of the use of military force is going to be. I think that red line quotation 1 year ago, a few months before the 2012 election, was one of those rhetorical flourishes that the president likes. He never thinks through the implications. We're now going to have military action. I think that's almost unavoidable. We have no idea what its impact will be inside Syria.
What about...
those points that he just made there are extraordinarily insightful. Obama goes off half-cocked and starts, writing checks with his parakeet mouth. But then, it's going to, at some point in time, he's going to have to cash them, and he's going to have to go to the alligator bank to do so. And that's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. We're positioned now in a spot where, in order to save his own face, he's willing to involve the United States in an international conflict, which the Chinese and the Russians are outstandingly against. And they've actually made, threats about it. So my concern, of course, is that, by going out there and operating unilaterally we are looking at the potential for the opening salvos of an international restoration of the Cold War and perhaps even a hot one.
What's impact outside Syria? We've got things like Russia. I mean, what's Russia going to? Russia's chummy with Syria, and they're not going to be. I mean, this isn't going to help things there.
No, I'm not. I don't think being concerned with how offended or not Russia or Iran or others might be. I think this still has to be a calculation of what's in America's national interest. I think those chemical weapons are dangerous. If the president's going to use any military force, what he ought to do is try and destroy the chemical weapons. Of course, every day that he waits, every day that he dithers, every day that he looks for some amorphous international approval gives the Assad regime the chance to move those chemical weapons and hide them.
How easy is it to move them?
Well, I think it's easy to move them. If I were the Assad regime, I'd store them in basements of apartment buildings in Damascus. I'd put them in heavily populated civilian areas. I'd take my command, control, communication structures of my military and I'd disperse them. I think that's what he's going to try and do. That's why the president's inability to articulate exactly what his objective is so telling. Kerry talks about a moral obscenity. Okay, let's assume that it is a moral obscenity. I think it is. He didn't say it was illegal, which would be their first preference because Syria didn't sign the Chemical Weapons Convention. He's not going to get United Nations approval, which would be the Obama administration's second choice because Russia and China will veto. So now we're down to an appeal to morality. 100,000 people have been killed in Syria. Let's say 2,000 were killed by chemical weapons. What is it that makes it 50 times more immoral to use chemical weapons that's finally got the Obama administration to move?
All right, well, I mean, look, I just looked at the timeline I had pulled up. May 19, 2011, President Obama said that the Syrian government must stop shooting its own demonstrators, allow human rights monitors to have access to cities, much like we have today, only it's chemical weapons, and it's UN inspectors. Then May 19th, he said we've stepped up our sanctions on the Syrian regime. That's 2011. July 2011, we keep the pressure up to see if we can bring some real change in Syria. That didn't happen. January 24th, 2012, State of the Union speech. A year and a half ago, he says, I have no doubt the Assad regime will soon discover the force of change can't be reversed and that human dignity can't be denied. Nothing happened. February 6, 2012, on NBC, he said once again that the noose is tightening around Assad. Nothing happened. March 4th, 2012, he said the Assad regime is crumbling. March 6, 2012, he said it's not a question of when Assad leaves or if he. It's not a question of when Assad leaves or if he leaves. It's a question of losing his legitimacy. So he's been saying this for 2 years and some change.
Sure. This is all for the president. Foreign policy is all about rhetoric. That's all that he understands about it. Like a legislator or politician, he gives a speech and moves on to something else. Now he has to ask, what are the implications when I use military force? And I would assert the hypothesis that even if he uses military force, even if he uses a lot of military force, we could still end up worse off from America's point of view than if he had done nothing at all.
Here's where it gets interesting now. What you're going to see here is she questions him about where this should go and what the issues would be surrounding whether or not we do take military action or not. And here's where his opinion gets interested. And by the way, you got to say the guy is spot on in his analysis so far.
If we have some strikes now, if that's what's going to happen, tell me the best thing that could happen, and tell me the worst thing that could happen.
Well, the best thing I think that could happen would be he destroys the chemical weapons stockpiles, and Assad has no possibility of using them again. But the real question is, are you going to take action that affects the balance of power inside Syria? Are you going to sufficiently go after Assad for this moral obscenity that it really tips the balance in favor of the rebels? One way to do that would be a decapitation strike. This is a moral obscenity. Go after the person who perpetrated it. I don't think he'll do that.
What's the worst thing that can happen?
Well, the worst that can happen is a few feckless cruise missile launches that really don't have much impact on the ground and that perpetuates the war. And I think that is the most likely outcome. It would take a character transplant for Obama to move effectively here.
I love that statement. It would take a character transplant. I mean, guys, if ever there was a reason for us to take together to collect a donation for a medical procedure, it would be for President Obama to get a character transplant. I'm actually willing to donate to that campaign.
Hey, let me quick back for a second. Did you say that we should do something about Assad?
Well, if you think this is a moral obscenity, shouldn't you go after the person you think ordered the attack?
What do you mean by going after him?
Kill him.
Okay.
That's war. That's what you do in war.
I was just trying to figure out exactly what you're saying. I didn't want to be, I didn't want to gray area. I didn't know exactly what you meant.
Here's the problem. To paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, you go to war with the president you have. And I don't think this president understands enough about the implications of what he's about to do, or even that he can define what his objective is, that it doesn't put us more at risk of using military force and actually undermining our long-term interest, with Iran in particular.
So essentially, Bolton is basically outlining the realities here for us. And, it's important that we understand the implications of going in here. His point is well taken, that if we're going to go to war, then we're going to go to war. But if we're going to sit there and lob a couple of cruise missiles in there and say we've done our duty, we've slapped his wrist, then that's exactly how Iran, and that's exactly how Syria, and that's exactly how Russia and China are going to look at this. They're going to say, we can get away with almost any human rights abuse we want because the long arm of the global police state, i.e. the United States of America, won't do anything but slap us on the hanny. And so what we're gonna end up with, and this is probably the end result of this disastrous policy, is that this president has painted us into a corner as a nation. He's made commitments on our behalf that actually don't have any real, that he doesn't even have the ability or the wherewithal to back up, much less does he have the approval of either the United States of America, Congress, or the international community to go out and act. But he's already committed to do so. So he's going to be willing to dash us to pieces against the rocks of international public opinion while he saves face for himself and his administration. And if there is one thing that this guy is, it is feckless. He will do almost anything to preserve his own reputation and his own view of himself. We know that this guy has got the thinnest skin of any president we've seen in modern history. And if there's one thing he doesn't like, it is to be looked at or viewed upon or viewed by the American people as weak or feckless or, ineffectual. He absolutely hates that. And what we can look forward to here is a disastrous move forward under the guise of this international incident and honestly, listen, the issue in Syria, as tragic as it is, I mean, we're talking about 100,000 people have been killed over the course of the last 2 years. We're looking at 300 dead from this chemical attack and 3,000 injured. But I got to point out the obvious here, which is something that nobody else seems to want to point to in the press. In Mexico, utilizing American weapons through Fast and Furious, there have been 50,000 killed there in the last 5 years on a drug war. So, I mean, and I mean, they're talking. You're talking about human rights abuses that are going on just in our right over our southern border, beheadings, disembowelings. I mean, those people down in Mexico who are in this not for political power but just sheer profit are as vicious and as dangerous to humanity as these people over in Syria. But nobody seems to care about that. I mean, they're not talking about dropping a cruise missile on Mexico City, are they? You see, the real problem here is this administration is going to use this as plausible deniability and as a means to use to get national attention off of the NSA scandal, the IRS scandal, the Obamacare debacle. They want to misdirect and redirect your attention and your focus away from what's really happening in the United States of America. They want to bolster their corporate cronies who will benefit from the financial windfall that will come as a result of a new, renewed war effort on a new front. That's what this is about. And the truth of the matter is, Obama couldn't give a rat's rear end about some people in Syria and whether or not they're breathing in gas. I mean, here's a guy who absolutely has no problem killing millions of children every day. In fact, he came out and declared when he was a state senator and a federal senator that it was okay to abort babies after birth. So does he really care about children? I think not. You're listening to America's Voice. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk in our last two segments about NSA and copyright infringement, how they're silencing free speech using copyright infringement as their weapon. And then in our last segment, the child porn setup that's being done right now on patriots across the nation in an attempt to try to silence them using child pornography through email as a methodology. Some dangerous stuff, folks. We'll be back in just a moment. You can find us live at americasvoicenow.org. We'll be back in just a moment. Stick with us.